A few decades ago, security forces would have killed to have access to a non-lethal weapon like this, something that would help them get a situation under control without unnecessary escalation. That's because prior to the development of effective non-lethal weapons, law enforcement more or less had two options when facing a threat: shout or shoot. But let's face it, there is a long list of alternatives that exist between verbal communications and lethal weapons. Believe it or not, one of the methods considered for physically securing nuclear weapons installations was to use sticky foam. Catch them like a spider would, alive. And not too long ago, personnel who guarded embassies often had no ammunition in their firearms. Even to this day, the vast majority of the police force in Great Britain do not carry firearms. The rationale was to prevent undesirable escalation in case of a conflict, but that left the law enforcement at risk. So in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, an effort began to develop non-lethal weapons, which is how things like pepper sprays and tasers were issued to law enforcement and in some places to citizens. But even though these devices can get the job done and their effects typically disappear within a short period of time, they're quite painful while they last. What would be nice is a way to restrain or incapacitate an individual who's a threat to themselves or others, but without inflicting much pain on them. Kinda like how cowboys use a lasso. Well, there's an idea. Bola-wrap handheld devices shoot out a Kevlar tether which wraps around the body and temporarily restrains uncooperative suspects or a person in crisis. The Kevlar tether has an anchor on each end with a safety cap on it, so they're less likely to pierce the skin and more likely to catch onto clothing. Bola-wraps may work well on one or few individuals, but they're not exactly practical when it comes to crowd control. In the mid-20th century, fire control systems were integrated into major cities, with fire hydrants located at every corner. They were handy when there was a fire, but they also had other uses, like this fire hydrant that was prepared for crowd control during a civil rights march in Atlanta, Georgia in 1960. The use of water cannons and fire trucks remain an effective non-lethal tactic to disperse riots. It's all unicorns and rainbows until it hits you. Then it's cold and wet. Tear gas can also disperse big crowds, but it can have severe physiological and psychological effects. In addition, tear gas can cause a lot of collateral damage with innocent bystanders. An ideal crowd control system would force people to leave without hurting them much, and the active denial system can supposedly do just that. Designed for perimeter security and crowd control, the active denial system works by firing a powerful directed electromagnetic radiation from over half a mile away. The heat waves penetrate the top 1/64-inch layer of the skin, which feels unpleasant and intense enough to cause a nearly instantaneous reflex to move away, at which time the sensation dissipates immediately. The operator can use a joystick to point the heat wave at one person or pan across a whole crowd. As far as we know, this system was never used operationally, and there are still concerns around its potential side effects. Similar to the active denial system, which uses unbearable heat, an acoustic hailing device generates unbearable sound. It's the sound equivalent of looking directly at the sun. But the very incident that inspired the development of acoustic hailing devices is not what you think. On October 12, 2000, a small boat approached the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Cole while the ship was at a port in Yemen for refueling. The boat pulled up right next to the Navy ship, and then a massive explosion happened, which created a 40 by 60-foot gash in the ship's port side, killed 17 U.S. Navy sailors, and injured nearly 40 more. USS Cole had to be transported on the heavy-lift ship Blue Marlin for repairs. Investigations revealed that the personnel on board USS Cole had tried to hail the approaching boat, but the two men on the boat just kept waving back in a friendly manner. The personnel, being unsure whether the two men could hear them clearly from the distance, waited for the boat to get closer, which gave the two Al-Qaeda suicide bombers a chance to blow up the boat right next to the ship. This tragic incident highlighted the need for naval personnel to have a way of contacting approaching vessels from far enough away that allows the personnel to respond appropriately to avert any danger. And this is exactly why acoustic hailing devices were invented, and the Long Range Acoustic Device, or LRAD, is a great example of it. But wait, Couldn't a loudspeaker, bullhorn, or megaphone already do this? See, the problem with common speakers is that even if the sound emitted was loud enough to reach a vessel hundreds of feet away, the clarity of the message that would be heard was questionable. This is known as the Charlie Brown effect. Here is a police helicopter using a megaphone at low altitude, broadcasting warnings to tailgaters before a football game. You can be sure those tailgaters kept on drinking. In contrast, this is another helicopter broadcasting a message using LRAD from a much farther distance.
This is a test of the long-range acoustic device, LRAD.
LRADs are specialized speakers that can deliver messages clearly from more than 3 miles away. This is why not only they're quite useful for navies to communicate to unknown vessels from a distance, but also at checkpoints in high-risk areas where any unknown vehicle could pose a threat. Communities that are prone to natural disasters traditionally have used sirens to notify the residents of an imminent danger, which is useful, but sirens don't provide any additional information. This is why the fire department at Mill Valley, California, upgraded their old sirens to LRADs, so in addition to notification, they can communicate messages and instructions to the residents. Their ability to effectively transmit loud sounds directionally and omnidirectionally also made LRADs a practical tool for crowd control. LRADs can generate extremely loud volumes, up to 160 decibels. As a point of reference, standing directly behind a jet engine as it takes off generates 130 to 140 decibels. Most people will experience pain at 140 decibels, so if not used properly, LRADs can cause permanent hearing damage. The beauty of non-lethal weapons is that they can be layered on top of each other as a situation escalates. For example, at a traffic control point, LRADs can communicate a clear verbal message from a safe distance to an approaching vehicle, asking the driver to stop. Now, they may not comply. Maybe the driver is deaf. Next step is to shoot them with a dazzler, a laser that sends a clear, non-verbal message and interferes with their vision. They may still not comply. Maybe the driver is blind. Then there are still other ways to stop the vehicle before we have to use a lethal weapon. We should clarify that non-lethal doesn't mean that it can't kill you. There are instances where both taser and tear gas have resulted in death. Non-lethal just means that it's not intended to kill you. That's why some prefer the term less lethal. But regardless, there is much room for improvement in non-lethal weapons and especially in procedures for their use. The non-lethality of these weapons is very much contingent on their proper use, which highlights the importance of training. Okay, that's a wrap.